Every contract league manager faces this moment. You drafted the player, you developed the player, they've helped you win games. Now their contract is expiring. The instinct feels obvious. You got to re-sign them. But smart front offices don't automatically retain good players. They let the market speak. On this episode of the Salary Cap Show, presented by Front Office Pros, we're breaking down when you should re-sign your players and when the smartest move is letting them test free agency. This is always a difficult decision in contract leagues when you have these players on your roster. You got to decide whether you're going to extend them or not. I know some contract leagues don't give you that option, but we know at Front Office Pros, we firmly believe that. And I think some of the core misconceptions when it comes to this idea of being able to extend players. I think, Joe, people think about that if a player is good, that you have to re-sign them. If you let them walk, it almost feels like a failure. And that if you let them go into free agency, it's almost going to create even more risk because now everybody else in your league can go after this player. And I think that's where if everybody has that mentality, then nobody hits the market. But then if everybody did allow people to hit the market, then it wouldn't be as bad.
Yeah, I think that's part of the problem is not everybody lets their players hit the market. So then you kind of feel even more so, I feel like the need to resign that player that, like you said, in the open there, you drafted a player, you feel like you developed them, you kind of build that personal connection almost with that player and you just feel like you have to resign them at that point. Can't let them hit the market just because then, if you do let them hit the market, most likely in free agency, these guys go for bunker prices and they're going to be a lot more expensive. But I feel like sometimes it is good to go ahead and let that player hit the market and see what the value is in order to figure out if the other league members actually like this player enough to sign him, or are you just paying a premium to bring that guy back because you're afraid to lose him.
Yeah, so I think one of the first things we wanted to touch upon in this episode is what letting a player actually does is it really allows them to test the market and it allows teams to really know what their actual value is. People don't think about this. When you let a player hit free agency, it really does reveal what their value is. Are other people going to pay as much as you think they are for this player? If you resign them, it removes the flexibility. You're locked in. You are taking on that future risk. Whereas if you let them go to the market, you can kind of see, how replaceable is this player? Does everybody else in my league feel the same way that I do about this player, or maybe they don't?
Yeah, but I think that also goes back to the point of a lot of these league members typically don't allow these guys to hit the market. So then it almost puts that additional pressure on you. Like because of the scarcity, more than likely, if you do let a guy hit the market, it's going to be harder for you to get him at a price you want to pay. So you almost have to go in just knowing like, there's a pretty good chance if it is at that point where the scarcity is there that, you're going to either let that guy go or you're going to have to pay a decent price to get him back.
Well, I think, and we're going to talk about that a little bit of when does it make sense? Like when should you let a player test free agency and when you should not, right? And I think scarcity is one of those things that we're going to be touching upon. But I think the big thing that I would say is a key takeaway is if you never let a player test the market, you really never know if you're overpaying.
Yeah, that is really true. I mean, if you're one of those teams or you're just like, if he hits the market, his price is going to skyrocket because everybody in free agency gets paid an astronomical number and it's way more than the resigning price. So you always just kind of resign them. That is a good point. You would never know like if your other league members value that player the same way and would actually cause his price to go up that much.
So when it comes to when you should let a player test free agency, and these are just a couple thoughts that we have as some clear signals that we feel it makes sense to say, hey, you got to let this player hit the market. The player is good, but they're not elite, right? I mean, you don't see elite even in the NFL. You don't see like a Jamar Chase hitting free agency, right? So these players are not elite, but they're good. The position has high replacement depth. Now, mind you, this kind of differs, from a fantasy perspective versus the NFL, or if you have full IDP or not. That could definitely change things because you're talking about more positions. Looking at your competitive window, we're going to talk about this quite a bit. But if your competitive window is unclear, and depending on where you are in your competitive window, that should change things. Is the contract demand rising fast, right? You have to think about it. It does go back to economics of supply and demand, right? So you kind of have an idea of what other players have went for in your league at that position. Do you have some, and I think this is a key one, do you have some internal succession options? If you're drafting correctly, you're already thinking ahead that I have some of these players that I don't think I'm going to sign or re-sign, and as a result, I'm drafting players that I think will succeed, and I'm okay moving on from that player. I don't know if people are thinking, I mean, NFL certainly does that they've drafted somebody and they already have that replacement. They don't have any intention of signing that player. But I think those are some of the key factors as to why we would recommend that you should let that player hit the market.
Yeah, and I think those make a lot of sense. I mean, obviously, like you said, some of that goes to supply and demand, but I think too the internal succession options is interesting, and just because I think it goes back to part of the one of our last ones talking about extensions, right? And if you truly, as we're seeing in the NFL, like if you truly value a player, you're going ahead and extending these guys, and they're not even hitting the expiration of their contract to where you have to think about resigning. And really, the players that end up hitting that resigning phase are guys you're kind of iffy about and not sure if you really, want to have them on your team. So maybe you're more inclined at that point to let them hit the market. Sure, you might like to have them back, but it's going to be at a certain number, and you're not just going to go like, blindly in there and be like, I got to get this guy back at whatever cost.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, you see in the NFL, not every good player deserves a second contract. We don't know yet, but it's looking very likely that Kenneth Walker is more than likely going to be a free agent. They're talking about, they have other priorities at the position, not at that position, but at other positions, and it's seeming like they're going to allow Kenneth Walker to test the market. Kenneth Walker, did fantastic. One of the main reasons why the Seahawks ended up making the Super Bowl and ultimately winning it. They're going to let him test the market. I think there are some managers in contract leagues that have a difficult time letting a good player hit the market. But I think if you would hesitate to sign that deal if they weren't already your player, I think that should be a time to pause. Because I think sometimes it's like, well, I feel like I have to make this. I can't let this player just hit the market. And so I'm going to extend them, when in reality, you'd be better off if you just let him hit the market.
Yeah, and that goes back to that emotional decision, like you said. You drafted him. You get emotional with having him on your team, so you go ahead and re-sign him because you want to keep him. You don't want to see the player that you've put so much effort into, and having him on your squad end up leaving. But I think one of the points too, like player that's good but not elite. I've heard free agency in NFL being classified as paying like elite money for just good players. And that's what happens in free agency. Like you said, nobody's really allowing these elite players to hit the market. These are good players, but then because of other factors in the market, drives up positional cost, and more than likely you're going to have to pay them above what their salary, above what they're actually you're going to get back in return as far as play on the field.
So for the players that we feel like you should re-sign instead, you shouldn't let them hit the market. We're not saying as a result that you should let everybody hit the market. That's not the answer. You just have to decide when is it the time to sign them and when is it the time to let them hit the market. So, if the player defines your competitive window, this is a player that is a building block for your team, that's more rebuilding terminology, but he's the type of player that's going to help you kind of get you over the hump, right? You're not going to want to let that player go. If the replacement cost is extreme, you have to consider what other options are out there, depending on who's in the draft at that position, who also could be free agents. If you're letting a key player go and that replacement cost seems extreme, it really doesn't make sense for that player to hit the market. Maybe we talked about this idea of the franchise tag. We talked about that in a previous episode. That's where it makes sense to use the franchise tag for an elite player, because it's like, well, I don't want to sign them. I don't maybe have the ability to sign them long term, but I don't want to just let them go because they're an elite player. You see that in the NFL where teams are saying, hey, this guy's really good. I don't know if I want to commit long term, but I want to use the franchise tag. Maybe the deal structure is team friendly. That's a consideration. Or looking at your cap hits, does it align with your timeline? Do you have the cap space? Based on your other contracts that you've really already allocated to and how much they cost. That's another consideration. So it's really a balance of viewing your roster, what contracts have you already committed to, and looking at your pipeline. Who do you have, that you've drafted? Who else is out there that you could pivot and sign? Those are all key factors to consider when thinking about re-signing. But if they're a core player, those are the type of players you want to keep. They can't be replaced.
Yeah, right. I mean, obviously, if they're core players, but I think, that was a good point too. Just depending on where you're at in your roster, like how much cap space you have, obviously it would make sense to resign a player. Like if there's not that many players available in free agency for you to go ahead and resign, and if it's a position that you don't necessarily have a lot of depth at, it would make, then at that point, it would make sense for you to go ahead and resign that player and make sure you got, somebody in that positional spot.
So considering, and we talked about this a little bit about windows, right? Because that's key. Understanding where you are at your roster. Are you a contender? Are you a team on the fringe? Are you a rebuilder? That matters. So I think when it comes down to the window and you look at contenders, some of the things that I think are important to keep in mind, and we've talked about this, you can justify controlled overpays, right? Like, okay, if I'm going to sign Jamar Chase to a long-term deal, I've got him controlled. Maybe I'm paying top dollar, but we know he's a really good player, and it's a controlled cost. Like, that's okay. Now, you do have to be leery of committing multiple years to multiple players, and you're possibly putting yourself in a trap situation that you've allocated so much money to key players that you're in trouble. But the reality is, championship window is maybe like a 2 or 3 year window, and you should definitely protect that and keep that core in place. But ultimately, at some point, you just won't be a championship team anymore.
Yeah, no. And I mean, that windows is an important one, and just being able to recognize, which window are you in. And we've also talked about in prior videos, you don't want to be, making the mistake thinking that you're going to be a contender for longer than you are, and just keep making bad mistakes that kill you in the end for your future. And then you're in a rough spot, and it almost forces you to go into a rebuild situation.
Well, and I think of the three situations, the one that might be the most challenging is if you're a fringe team. That is the most dangerous, because ultimately we would recommend that you should lean towards testing the market versus locking yourself into mediocrity, and then you just are going to be playing in the middle. We've talked about this before. I'm with you. I'd rather be either full rebuild or I'm fully competing. I don't really like staying in the middle. I don't really think that helps.
No. And I mean, it's nice because maybe you feel like because you're always kind of in it, you're in the middle of the pack. At the end of the day, there's so many, I feel like the teams that ride the middle, I feel like there's so many different opportunities that they'd have to either, make a few trades or some key moves and be elevate yourself to be a contender, or, just realize like, hey, maybe you should be trading away some assets and really just be willing to enter this, the rebuild phase, and then maybe get yourself a couple of years down the road up to that contender phase. But instead they just kind of ride the middle of the pack, and it feels safe, but at the same point, like, you're not going to win just being able to be one of those fringe middle teams.
No, and I think when it comes to now kind of switching to the rebuilding team, I think it's almost always beneficial to have market discovery and allowing your, if you're not in you're not there, you're not going to compete. And you've got veterans that, are the type of players that are win now type of players. If you haven't already tried trading them away and getting something for them, I think you're just better off on avoiding a long-term extension for a veteran and letting them hit the market. If you're going to rebuild well, you got to rebuild to the draft. I'm not saying that you can't add players in free agency, but signing players that just don't fit your window and you're not there, it doesn't make sense to sign them to a 2-year, 3-year deal. It just, I think that's the type of thing that could really hurt you at the end. I think some teams think like, well, let me sign the player, and then I can sign them. I can try to trade them. But that's easier said than done.
Yeah, definitely your core pieces to build around have to come through the draft. And basically, free agency is a good tool to use to fill in the auxiliary pieces where maybe you haven't done as well drafting, or just haven't had the opportunity to fill those positions, in the draft, and have a young stud player, but just need somebody that can kind of patchwork that spot. Now that's where free agency comes in. But I definitely agree, if you're in that rebuilding phase, you got somebody that's coming on the end of the contract, like, one, you should be doing everything you can to trade them before he even gets to their signing period. But if you can get a deal done, don't make the mistake of going ahead and bringing them back on the roster.
I think we've had that problem where, you try to hang on a little bit longer, and ultimately you would have been better off. There have been other managers. There have been some managers I think that have shown really good discipline and have elected to let these players hit the market, and others haven't. I know you and I have been in our contract league. We've been more ones that have been willing to let players hit the market. But like I think of an example for you. You had Michael Pittman. Yeah, you had traded him, and he was a player that, in all intents and purposes, people would say, "Oh, well, you shouldn't let him go. Like, he's a good enough player. You should keep him." You decided to let him hit the market, and I want to say the team that signed him for something crazy, like almost like 30 mil a year or something for 3 years. And that contract has been an albatross for that team. I mean, it hasn't really hurt him, but there's no way that manager's getting his money's worth for Pittman. And at the end of the day, and we'll talk about this a little later, and front office pros, we have compensatory picks. So you were able to get a compensatory pick, letting, just like the NFL, and letting Pittman hit the market, and you're not paying him $30 million a year, and somebody else is in the league.
Yeah, well, and that's the part, right? I think we, talking about good players, ended up having to pay him top dollar at the top of the market. I mean, that was Michael Pittman's he's a good solid wide receiver, but he shouldn't be getting upper echelon money by any means. And yeah, now just looking at it, and his future is uncertain with the Indianapolis Colts too. So it'll be interesting to see if they ultimately, in our conversation here, do they let Michael Pittman hit the market as it's been rumored?
And it seems like it will. And now that manager who has Pittman's even more in the lurch, maybe he goes to a better situation, but that's never a given. I mean, anytime a player is released and goes to free agency, there's not a guarantee that they're going to, garner the demand that, based on their name. I mean, Pittman's getting older. He's had some good productive years in Indianapolis, but it's no guarantee that he'll be able to just go somewhere else and have a prominent role in that offense.
Yeah, that is very true. I mean, I think I've learned to try to have better discipline when it comes to re-signing players and just free agency as a whole. And part of that strategy is the fact that you get the comp picks in return, and the idea that, you do rebuild from the draft, and those extra picks certainly are more valuable than they seem.
Well, and that certainly helps. So we're going to be talking about that. But you alluded to kind of the psychology trap, if you will, that managers end up re-signing players because they end up being attached to the player because they acquired them somehow with the draft or trade. They fear losing value. I think, what are your thoughts of how to overcome that? Because in my opinion, the safest decision today can become the biggest cap problem tomorrow. And I think if people decide to say, "Oh, well, I got have this mindset, I gotta keep this player, I can't let them go," we're going to be talking about some of the benefits. And a compensatory pick certainly helps with this idea of, I'm going to let this player in the market because I'll get a comp pick out of it. But even then, though, like, I guess you said you learned this over time. What has been helpful for you to kind of see the light, to be like, you know what, I'm gonna let this player, who's a good player, who previously I probably would have kept, but now I'm like, no, he's a good player to hit the market.
Yeah, I think as far as the psychology trap, which I do think is a real thing, just to avoid it, you have to get rid of the emotion, because that is the emotion thing. It's just like, you've drafted this player, he's been on your roster, you feel that level of attachment, you just can't necessarily get rid of him. But I think that's because you got the emotional decisions trying to drive you. And I think you just got to strictly look at it from, the number standpoint, not even more so like, sure, player production comes involved, but just the cost, your cap situation, trying to set up your cap situation, even not just for this upcoming season, but for years down the road. And I think that's been part of it too, is more so, I feel like I was always doing things from a year-to-year basis instead of trying to do a better job at forecasting and trying to figure out, what my decisions, how they're affecting me, not only, today and this year, but how does this contract ultimately affect me down the road as well?
I think for me, two things that have always been helpful when it comes to the resigning decision for me is, one, being okay with the idea of, I think this player is asking for too much, or I'm gonna have to pay too much for the player. I'm okay letting them hit the market, and if I get him for cheaper, great. But if I lose him, that's okay, right? Like, the plan to say, this is what I'm willing to pay for this. I mean, think about it. I know it's a little bit different, but like, if you go to the store or something, you want to buy a laptop, and it's like, I'm only willing to pay $800, and it's like, well, I got this really nice laptop for $1,000, and I really was only coming in to pay $800. I think that's okay to put a stake in the ground and say, okay, this is what I'm willing to pay. I'm going to let them hit the market. If I don't get them, then that's okay. The other thing for me that I really lean into, and I know I think about this a little bit differently, but it's playing defense, right? If I think there's a player that I'm not all that convinced about, and I think that somebody else in the league is going to spend, buku bucks for the player, I'm going to let this player, hit the market, and they're going to take the bait, and it's going to be a trap. And I'm going to see them paying them, wads and wads of cap space to a player that ultimately I think could sink their team. So to me, I think about that. If I'm not convinced with the player, I think that he could kind of cause a little sabotage. I'm going to take it. Can I get a comp pick out of it?
Yeah. Yeah, your defensive idea is kind of crazy. I don't necessarily see things that way, but definitely, practicing discipline, putting your stake in the ground, and ultimately being okay that you lose a player. Because I know, as you mentioned in the beginning too, like having the idea that, basically letting a guy hit the market can be an admission that you failed on that draft pick or you failed on that player because now you're not even getting him that second contract that you thought you would. That's kind of creeped in my head, but those are all kind of emotional decisions. You're going to try to, keep the emotions out of it the best you can.
You don't think teams in the NFL think like that? Like they have a player who they like, they don't love, but they know that if that player hit the market, maybe they have like more of a traits type player, that some team is going to overpay, for the player, and they believe that that's going to adversely affect the team.
I think for sure. I mean, I don't know. I don't know if they necessarily think defense that it's going to be negatively hurt that team. I think they mostly think like
about my team, how it's
right. I think it's GMs, because I'm thinking about like how, Bill Belichick, and he was always looked at as ruthless, but what he was really good at was getting rid of players a year ahead of time before they hit that dip, instead of, paying them to keep that player. And then all of a sudden they decline on his roster. Instead, he got ahead of the game and let those players decline on somebody else's roster and ultimately their dollar.
I know this was more of a trade, but don't you think that maybe Pete Carroll and John Schneider, when they made that Russell Wilson trade, that based on what they were seeing in Seattle and some of the rumblings around Russell Wilson, that they kind of felt like that Russell Wilson, I mean, obviously the Broncos are in the AFC, so they don't really see them or compete with them that much to say that it would truly affect them. But I have to think in the back of their mind, they're thinking, okay, this could go sideways.
Sure. I mean, they had their own reasons, but I don't know if they were like, oh yeah, let's trade in the Broncos, sabotage the Broncos. I don't know if they had that idea, more so just, I think obviously they saw, Russell Wilson, he wanted out of there, and they just saw it negatively affecting their team. So how can we make our team better, and let's trade him and then get him to the quarterback needy team, and then ultimately they benefit from draft picks.
Yeah, I think some of the hidden benefits of letting players walk, some things that we jotted down that comes to mind. You're improving your long-term cap health. You're not dedicating contracts to players that you shouldn't. So that's going to ultimately allow you to be a little more healthy from a cap perspective. We already talked about comp picks, and we have compensatory picks in front office pros, which emulates how the NFL does it. Helps a lot. If I lose a good player and I get a third or fourth round comp pick, that's huge. I also think, preventing future dead cap traps. We've talked about dead cap, how it can be used as a tool. But if you've signed a lot of players that you shouldn't, at some point, that dead cap could really haunt you, especially at the end of those contracts, like we talked about, like a Pittman contract, where, let's say Pittman never reclaims the role that he had in Indianapolis. Now you're paying a player way over value, and you're basically going to have to cut him because the value is just too extreme.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's under, just kind of the unfortunate timing of it all, if the fact that most likely if he does go somewhere, I think it'll be tough for him to kind of reclaim the role that he currently has with the Indianapolis Colts. And then no doubt that owner is going to be just absolutely regretting that decision and paying him way too much versus the production he's going to get out of Pittman moving forward.
So when you're thinking about re-signing a player, this is a kind of a framework that you can think about. Before you re-sign the player, ask yourself, is this player core? Is he a part of my core for the next 2 to 3 years? Is this player going to have a huge impact that could make or break my seasons going forward. Is their projected contract aligned with my cap structure? You know the contracts that you've already allocated to. You know when the cap hits are going to be a little bit heavier. So does it make sense from a cap space perspective? And would, I sign this exact deal if they were someone else's player. So let's say they were free agency. It's Joe's player. It's not my player. Would I sign that player in free agency for that value, or it's just because it's my player and I don't want them to hit the market? Trying to get yourself out of the psychological trap of like, well, I had this player, I got to keep him, yada, yada, yada. I think that will help. I mean, if you ask those three questions to yourself, that'll kind of give you some guidance as to whether or not you should ultimately keep the player and re-sign them via an extension or let them hit the mark.
Yeah, no, I think those are definitely some good questions to kind of ask yourself before jumping in and go ahead and re-signing the player, because then I feel like if you're asking these, it helps you keep the emotions out of it and you make a logical decision. I think one of the good ones is that last one, just being like, would I sign that player to the exact same deal if it was another person's player? Or you like, man, I really hope, Steve signs that guy to it, because that he should not be paying him that much money. He's not worth it.
Well, I give a lot of credit. I think we talked about this in a previous episode, but if I did, forgive me here. But, I had signed defensive tackle Chris Jones in free agency this past offseason, and John in our league decided to let him go. I was shocked that he did, because he's, this name. I mean, he's one of the most renowned defensive players out there. I would say for most NFL fans, I would say he's in the top 10 people who just recognize his name. And he has the ability, we've seen it with the sack potential from an interior defensive lineman. We don't see that from that position. So he's kind of a unicorn. So to me, I'm like, okay, I can't believe he hit the market, and I signed him to a huge deal. And boy, do I regret it, because he absolutely stunk. And that was I give John credit. He had a lot of name value. He said, I'm going to let this player hit the market. I'm okay. I don't even know if he tried to re-sign him or not, if he just said, I'm good. He had Leonard Williams, who he decided to keep, who was incredible. And he had a succession plan. He drafted Byron Murphy, who at first we were kind of wondering what's going on because he didn't get a lot of playing time, but he really jumped on the scene even last year. So he played that perfectly. Whereas he could have paid Chris Jones top dollar and re-signed him. He's a name. He could have kept him. But he stuck him. I'm stuck with him now, and I gave him all this money. That's a situation where it's like, he decided not to do it, and I give him props. It's hard to make those decisions. It's hard, like you mentioned, the Bill Belichick. It's hard to kind of be a year ahead and know not to sign a player, have the discipline, let them hit the market.
Yeah. I mean, Bill Belichick was one of the best at it, but yeah, it is really hard to be that disciplined, and especially when a guy like Chris Jones has that name value. But like you said, I mean, I think what made it easier for John was he really had that succession plan, liked the depth that he had at defensive tackle, so felt like he could let the name value go. So based on your logic, Steve, do you feel like John sabotaged you with putting Chris Jones out there and having you pay him top dollar?
I mean, I don't know. He probably wasn't thinking about it from that perspective, but if he did, I'd give him more credit. Because ultimately he did sabotage me. I had all that cap space allocated to Chris Jones, and if I didn't, I could have had more flexibility to do other things. And as a result, he kind of was an anchor on my team, pulling me down in a bad way. He's an albatross on that his contract was not friendly, and it's still not friendly. I hope as a Bills fan, I kind of hope he doesn't turn around, but. From a fantasy perspective of my team, I hope he turns it around. And I think that he, defensive is interesting. It's a little bit different than offense. They can kind of have off years, but then all of a sudden bounce back. So he didn't have any injuries to our knowledge. So I don't know what happened to him. But again, I give John credit. I think there was probably some level of sabotage of knowing that he's a big name, he'll get paid a lot of money, and John just didn't think he was worth it.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I mean, that's the thing. If you don't necessarily need that older veteran player for depth or think he's going to be that good, I mean, those are easy ones to let walk, and they're going to get paid big money. And then if you do have that comp system, those are the players you end up getting comp picks in return for.
The biggest mistake in salary cap contract leagues isn't letting good players walk. It's re-signing the wrong players out of fear and then spending the next 2 seasons trying to escape the contract you didn't need to sign. If you're not 100% sure that player belongs in your core for the next few seasons, let the market tell you what they're worth. If the number comes back reasonable, great, and you can re-sign them with confidence. If it comes back inflated, even better. You just protected your cap and preserved your flexibility. Because ultimately, championships aren't built by keeping everyone. You just can't keep every single player. They're built by keeping the right players at the right prices at the right time. If you enjoyed this episode, support the show by downloading it, following the Salary Cap Show, and leaving a 5-star review. It helps other Dynasty managers find our show. Thanks for listening to the Salary Cap Show, presented by Front Office Pros, and we will see you next time.